Chapter 1. The Darkness Falls. The first reports came from fishing vessels off the coast of Maine. Their radios went silent at 7:42 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a crisp autumn afternoon. No distress calls, no mayday signals, just silence. By 11:45 a.m. the next morning, the eastern seaboard of the United States plunged into darkness. Traffic lights blinked out, hospital generators failed to kick in, and planes began their fatal descent into the Atlantic Ocean, leaving trails of smoke in their wake. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic in the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Oliver Tennant was addressing Parliament when Westminster went dark. The backup generators failed to activate, and the historic chamber was plunged into shadow, illuminated only by the weak autumn sunlight filtering through the windows. In the ensuing confusion, the Prime Minister was evacuated to a secure location beneath Downing Street.
Status report,
Tennant ordered, as his security detail guided him through narrow corridors by flashlight.
It's widespread, sir,
Replied his chief of staff, scrolling through a rapidly dying tablet.
All of London, the southern coast. Reports coming in from Edinburgh and Belfast as well. Total electrical failure.
the Americans.
The same, sir. And preliminary reports suggest the entire Atlantic coastline is affected, from Norway to Morocco.
In Moscow, President Darryl Kokoloff was awakened by his security chief at 11:42 p.m. local time. The Russian leader, known for his ice-cold demeanor, showed rare concern when informed that the entirety of Russia's Western naval forces had gone silent simultaneously.
The Black Sea Fleet, the Northern Fleet.
Kokoloff asked.
All communications lost, Mr. President. And St. Petersburg has gone dark. Moscow is unaffected so far, but the blackout appears to be moving eastward along our western regions.
Kokoloff's first thought was of American aggression, perhaps a new weapon test gone awry. His second thought was more pragmatic. Advantage. With NATO countries along the Atlantic in chaos, opportunities would emerge.
Contact Beijing.
He ordered.
I want to speak with President Chen immediately.
In Beijing, President Chen Liang had already convened an emergency meeting of the Central Military Commission. Although China's east coast faced the Pacific rather than the Atlantic, the implications of a massive power failure affecting Western powers demanded immediate assessment.
Is this our doing?
Chen asked her defense minister bluntly when they were alone.
No, Ms. President. Our electromagnetic pulse technologies are advanced, but nothing in our arsenal could cause effects of this magnitude.
The Russians, then? Or the Americans testing something they shouldn't?
Unknown, Ms. President. But our intelligence suggests all parties are equally surprised.
As reports continued to flow in, President Chen made a calculated decision.
Increase our military readiness to level 2 and prepare relief supplies, medicine, food, generators. We may find diplomatic opportunities in this crisis.
Within hours, the leaders of the world's most powerful nations were grappling with a catastrophe that defied explanation and testing how it might shift the global balance of power. Sandra Reeves, Sandy to her colleagues at the National Marine Fisheries Service, was examining tissue samples from a peculiar deep-sea specimen when her laboratory went dark. The backup generator should have activated immediately, but nothing happened. Through the large bay windows of her coastal Maine laboratory, She watched as the lights of Portland winked out street by street, like dominoes falling in sequence.
What the hell?
She muttered, instinctively reaching for her cell phone. No signal. Her satellite phone, dead. Even her battery-operated flashlight refused to work. As daylight faded, reports trickled in through runners and messengers on bicycles. The blackout wasn't isolated to Maine or even the East Coast. Every nation bordering the Atlantic had gone dark simultaneously. Planes had dropped from the sky. Satellites had fallen. Ships had lost all power and were drifting helplessly. The Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard of technology. In Washington, D.C., President Barron's Trumsky had been meeting with his Joint Chiefs when the White House went dark. Secret Service agents immediately moved him to a secure location beneath the White House, a bunker designed to withstand nuclear attacks. It couldn't, however, maintain power any better than the corner store on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Get me answers,
The president requested in an authoritative tone, his face illuminated by the flickering glow of hastily deployed candles.
Is this the Chinese? The Russians?
The Secretary of Defense wiped sweat from his brow.
We can't confirm anything, Mr. President. All communications are down. We're completely in the dark, literally and figuratively.
What about the diplomatic channels, the secure lines to Moscow and Beijing?
All down, sir. We've tried Morse code, signal lamps, everything short of carrier pigeons. Nothing's getting through to either the Russians or Chinese.
The Secretary of State interjected,
Mr. President, before communications failed, we received fragmentary reports that Moscow and Beijing are experiencing similar phenomena along their Atlantic-facing territories. St. Petersburg is completely dark. This doesn't appear to be a targeted attack against the United States.
Trumsky's eyes narrowed.
Or it's meant to look that way. Both Russia and China have been investing heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities. This could be a test or a prelude to something worse.
Then get me people who can confirm something.
Trumsky snapped.
Form a task force. Get our best people. I want answers by tomorrow.
Outside the White House, Washington, D.C. had descended into chaos. Without traffic lights, intersections became scenes of twisted metal and shattered glass. Hospitals struggled to maintain life support systems. The modern world, so dependent on electricity, crumbled in a matter of hours. By midnight, reports confirmed what many feared. The blackout extended to every nation with an Atlantic coastline. From Norway to Argentina, from Canada to Morocco, darkness had fallen on nearly 1 billion people. As dawn broke the next day, the true scope of the disaster became apparent. Commercial jets and military aircraft alike had plummeted into the ocean or crashed onto land. Satellites had fallen from orbit, raining debris across coastal areas. Ships drifted aimlessly. The death toll already reached into the thousands, with tens of thousands more missing. In London, Prime Minister Tennant surveyed the damage from a military helicopter, powered by a hastily modified mechanical engine. The Thames was choked with dead vessels, and fires burned unchecked across parts of the city where gas lines had ruptured. The iconic London skyline, normally illuminated by countless lights, stood dark and foreboding against the gray morning sky.
The hospitals.
Tennant asked his emergency response coordinator.
Critical patients are being moved inland to facilities beyond the blackout zone. We've got army medics using hand-powered equipment where possible. The death toll in London alone is estimated at 600, with thousands injured.
And our nuclear facilities.
Sellafield and other sites initiated emergency shutdown protocols. Backup cooling systems are operating on steam power where possible, but we're racing against time.
Back in Moscow, President Kokolov received his first direct communication from Beijing, a message delivered by a diplomatic courier who had flown to the still-functioning Moscow International Airport on a Chinese military aircraft specially modified with mechanical backup systems.
President Chen proposes a joint humanitarian and investigative effort, the courier reported, handing over a sealed document. China is prepared to provide significant resources to affected regions, including Russian territories, in exchange for access and information sharing.
Kokolov understood the underlying message. China was positioning itself as the savior of a crippled world. It was a diplomatic masterstroke that would be difficult to counter.
Tell President Chen we are open to coordination.
Kokolov replied carefully.
But Russia will maintain sovereign control over its response efforts.
He paused.
And what of the Americans?
There has been no direct contact with Washington. President Chen believes this is an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of our collaborative approach over American isolationism.
Kokolov nodded slowly. The global order was already shifting. In the Oval Office, illuminated now by oil lamps, President Trumsky convened the hastily assembled Atlantic Event Response Team, AERT. The team comprised officials from the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, the intelligence community, and key scientific advisors.
An EMP attack,
suggested General Michael Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Has to be. Nothing else could cause this kind of widespread electrical failure.
Dr. Eliza Chen, the Energy Secretary, shook her head.
An EMP wouldn't affect battery-powered devices or mechanical systems. This is something else entirely. Whatever it is, it's disrupting the fundamental principles of electromagnetism, at least in the affected areas.
China has been researching quantum-level electromagnetic disruption,
offered CIA Director Thomas Wilson.
And the Russians have always been ahead of us in directed energy weapons.
What about coordination between them?
Trumsky asked.
Russia and China have been conducting joint military exercises with increasing frequency over the past 2 years.
It's possible,
Wilson admitted.
Our intelligence indicates their defense ministries have increased communication significantly in recent months. However, both countries are experiencing similar effects along their Atlantic coasts, unless this is an experiment gone terribly wrong.
Or a calculated sacrifice,
the president countered.
The Russians especially have a history of accepting casualties to advance strategic goals.
The Secretary of State cleared her throat.
Mr. President, we've received word through diplomatic back channels that both China and Russia are organizing humanitarian relief efforts. Beijing has offered aid to affected European nations, and Moscow is positioning itself as the coordinator for Eastern European response.
They're taking advantage of the situation,
Trumsky said flatly.
Buying influence while we're struggling to get our lights on.
It might be more than that, sir,
the secretary continued.
The UK has reported that Chinese diplomats are requesting access to affected areas for their scientific teams. Prime Minister Tenet is hesitant but desperate for assistance.
The president nodded grimly.
I want proof before we point fingers. In the meantime, we need power. We can't coordinate a response in the dark.
We've already begun implementing a contingency plan,
said Dr. Chen.
We're retrofitting coal plants for steam power generation. It's primitive, but it should work. The technology doesn't rely on complex electronics.
How long?
The president asked.
3 days for the first facilities. A week before we have a functional grid, even at minimal capacity.
Trumsky nodded.
Make it happen. Prioritize military installations, command centers, and hospitals. And find me those responsible. I want names.
As Washington scrambled to restore some semblance of order, Sandy Reeves noticed something strange happening along the Maine coastline. Strange deep-sea creatures, species that typically never approach the surface, were washing ashore in unprecedented numbers. Giant squid, anglerfish, gulper eels, creatures of the deep now lying dead on the beaches by the hundreds. Sandy's laboratory remained powerless, but her curiosity drove her to examine these specimens, using the most basic tools of her trade: a magnifying glass and a scalpel. What she found disturbed her deeply. The creatures showed signs of rapid, impossible evolution. Organs were transforming, reshaping themselves for purposes she couldn't identify. But without her equipment, without electricity, she could only document and wonder. Little did she know that these Dead Sea creatures heralded the first sign of a transformation that would soon threaten humanity's very existence. Chapter 2: Primitive Solutions. 3 days after what was now being called the Atlantic event, the first steam-powered generators came online in Washington, D.C. Black smoke billowed from hastily constructed smokestacks as coal-fired boilers turned massive turbines. The technology was antiquated, inefficient, and dirty, but it worked. The White House became the first building to regain power, followed by the Pentagon, key military installations, and selected hospitals. The power wasn't stable, and it certainly wasn't clean, but it provided the basic electricity needed to begin coordinating a response. Similar efforts were underway across the Atlantic. In London, the British government had repurposed old coal plants in the Midlands, creating a primitive but functional electrical grid that powered essential services. British engineering firms worked around the clock to design and build mechanical alternatives to electronic systems. Prime Minister Tennant addressed Parliament, which now met in Birmingham beyond the blackout zone.
Britain faced its darkest hour once before and prevailed,
he declared, deliberately echoing Churchill.
We shall overcome this challenge as we have overcome all others, with ingenuity, determination, and the unbreakable spirit of the British people.
In Russia, President Kokolov took a different approach. With much of Western Russia still affected by expanding blackouts, he relocated key government functions to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. From this new command center, he coordinated Russia's response and calculated its opportunities.
The Americans are isolated,
he told his inner circle.
Their navy is crippled, their air force is mostly grounded. NATO is fragmented without communications. We must secure our interests while they are weak.
Russian mechanized divisions began moving toward their western borders, officially for humanitarian assistance to affected regions in Belarus and Ukraine, but Western observers noted their distinctly non-humanitarian composition. China, meanwhile, implemented what it called Operation Helping Hand. Cargo ships loaded with generators, medical supplies, and food departed from Shanghai and other eastern ports, bound for affected regions across Europe and Africa. Each shipment came with technical advisors and security teams, extending China's influence under the guise of humanitarian aid. President Trumsky addressed the nation via radio broadcast, using equipment specially designed to function with the unstable power supply.
My fellow Americans, we face an unprecedented crisis. An attack on our way of life has occurred, and we will find those responsible. The United States will not be cowed. We will rebuild. We will restore power, and we will have justice.
Behind the confident words lay a stark reality. America's global influence was waning by the hour, as China and Russia filled the power vacuum, both literally and figuratively. The speech struck a defiant tone, but behind closed doors, the administration remained baffled. The AERT had yet to determine the cause of the blackout, though theories abounded. Most centered around some form of advanced weapons, technology deployed by a hostile nation,
The Chinese have denied involvement.
reported Secretary of State Andra Phillips during the morning briefing.
So have the Russians. For what it's worth, they're experiencing the same chaos along their Atlantic coasts.
What about diplomatic channels?
Asked the president.
Limited and deteriorating.
Phillips answered.
We've established rudimentary communication with London using modified radio equipment. Prime Minister Tenet reports Chinese humanitarian teams are already operating in Liverpool and Bristol. They brought their own security forces, heavily armed for humanitarian workers.
And the Russians.
Moscow is making moves in Eastern Europe. Military movements under the guise of emergency response. NATO is trying to coordinate a response, but without proper communications, it's fragmented at best. The UK is prioritizing domestic concerns over alliance obligations.
Can we blame them?
Muttered the defense secretary.
We're all fighting for survival here.
What about direct communication with Moscow and Beijing?
Trumsky pressed.
We've sent diplomatic couriers to both capitals via mechanically modified aircraft.
Phillips replied.
The Russian response was non-committal. The Chinese expressed deep concern and offered humanitarian assistance, with conditions that would effectively give their technical teams access to sensitive infrastructure and military installations.
Wolves in sheep's clothing.
Trumsky growled.
They're exploiting this crisis to redraw the global order.
It may be worse than that, sir.
The intelligence director interjected.
Our limited surveillance capabilities show Russian and Chinese military forces conducting joint exercises in the Sea of Japan. They're acting with an unusual level of coordination.
Of course they deny it.
The president replied.
What about our cyber team? Any progress?
Dr. Maya Patel, the newly appointed head of the Cyber Response Division, stepped forward.
Sir, we've begun examining affected electronic devices using the new power sources. We're seeing something unusual.
Define unusual,
demanded the president.
The core programming in these devices has been altered at a fundamental level. It's not just that they've been disabled, they've been reprogrammed to self-destruct. And the code, it's unlike anything we've seen before. It's not following conventional programming logic.
Hackers,
concluded the president.
Has to be.
Dr. Patel hesitated.
Perhaps, sir. But if so, they're using methods we've never encountered. The code appears to be evolving.
Evolving? How?
It's rewriting itself in response to our attempts to analyze it. Almost like...
Like what, Doctor?
like an organism adapting to its environment.
The president dismissed the notion with a wave of his hand.
Find me the hackers responsible. I want raids conducted on every known hacker collective. Anonymous, Lulzsec, Red Hacker, all of them. Someone knows something.
Within 24 hours, raids were conducted across the globe. Known hackers were arrested, their equipment confiscated. The administration presented these actions as progress, but the arrested hackers appeared genuinely bewildered by the accusations.
You think we did this?
Laughed Marcus Green, a notorious hacker known as Phantom, during his interrogation.
We couldn't do this if we wanted to. This isn't a hack. This is something else entirely.
Similar scenes played out in the United Kingdom, where British intelligence conducted raids on suspected hacker collectives in Manchester and Glasgow. Prime Minister Tennant, under immense public pressure, authorized the operations despite reservations from civil liberties advocates within his government.
We cannot afford to overlook any possibility,
Tennant told his cabinet.
If there's even a remote chance these groups have information about the event, we must act.
In Russia, President Kokolov took a more direct approach. Known hackers were rounded up by security services and subjected to harsh interrogation methods. Many were never seen again. When human rights organizations protested, Kokolov dismissed their concerns.
Russia faces an existential threat,
he declared.
The niceties of peacetime have no place in such a crisis.
China, meanwhile, presented itself as the voice of reason. President Chen publicly criticized both Western and Russian approaches.
In times of global crisis, we need cooperation, not accusations,
she stated during a rare international broadcast.
China stands ready to work with all nations to resolve these crises through scientific collaboration and mutual assistance.
Behind this magnanimous facade, however, Chinese intelligence services conducted their own aggressive operations against domestic and foreign hacker groups, though with characteristic discretion. As the raids continued, public sentiment began to turn. With limited power restored only to government facilities and hospitals, civilians remained in the dark. Protests erupted in major cities, with demonstrators demanding action to restore basic services. Power to the people! Read signs illuminated by candlelight in Times Square. Human rights, not witch hunts, proclaimed banners outside FBI field offices where hackers were being detained. In London, thousands gathered outside Parliament buildings, their faces illuminated by gas lamps and candles. Help us before helping others, their signs read, a direct criticism of the Tennant government's decision to accept Chinese assistance while British citizens suffered. Meanwhile, Sandy Reeves had taken matters into her own hands. Her small laboratory near Portland, Maine, had a unique advantage. A prototype wave energy converter she had been testing for marine research. With some modifications, she managed to generate enough electricity to power her basic equipment. The specimens she had collected told a disturbing story. Under her electron microscope, she identified strange microorganisms in the tissue samples, entities that resembled mechanical constructs, but appeared organic in nature.
What are you?
She whispered, adjusting the microscope's focus. The organisms resembled nanobots, but they moved and divided like living cells. They integrated seamlessly with the host tissue, rewriting the creature's DNA in real time. Even more disturbing were the anatomical changes in the specimens. Creatures that had spent their evolutionary history in the ocean depths were developing structures resembling primitive lungs. Their gill systems were shrinking while new respiratory systems formed. Sandy documented her findings meticulously, but her attempts to contact government officials proved futile. With communications still down across most of the eastern seaboard, her discoveries remained isolated in her small, coastal laboratory. As she worked, a new development arose. Reports of a strange illness began to emerge from the few hospitals with power. People were reporting breathing difficulties, unexplained fevers, and disorientation. The symptoms didn't match any known pathogen, and doctors were baffled. The mysterious illness wasn't limited to American shores. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service reported similar cases in coastal communities from Dover to Edinburgh. British researchers, working with primitive equipment powered by coal and steam, noted the prevalence of symptoms in communities with direct access to Atlantic waters.
It's spreading inland,
reported Dr. James Harrington, Chief Medical Advisor to the Prime Minister.
Initially confined to coastal areas, but now we're seeing cases in Birmingham, over 100 miles from the sea.
Across the Channel, French authorities reported identical patterns. In St. Petersburg, Russian medical facilities were overwhelmed with patients exhibiting the same respiratory distress. President Kokolov, ever paranoid, became convinced this was a biological attack, coordinated with the electromagnetic disruption.
First they blind us, then they poison us,
he told his defense counsel.
We must prepare appropriate responses.
Chinese intelligence, monitoring Russian communications through their humanitarian teams in Eastern Europe, noted Kokolov's increasing paranoia with concern. President Chen ordered accelerated research into the illness, deploying medical teams to affected areas with a dual mission: provide genuine assistance while gathering critical intelligence. At a secure facility in Shanghai, Chinese scientists made the same discovery Sandy was approaching in her main laboratory: the presence of unknown microorganisms in tissue samples from affected patients. But without access to the deep-sea specimens Sandy was studying, they couldn't make the crucial connection between marine life and human symptoms. Unknown to Sandy, the same microorganisms she had discovered in the deep-sea creatures were already finding their way into human hosts across continents. The transformation had begun, transcending national boundaries and geopolitical rivalries in its inexorable advance. Chapter 3: The Spreading Darkness. 1 week after the Atlantic event, the blackout's reach extended deeper into the continental United States. Chicago went dark on a Wednesday afternoon, its skyscrapers becoming black monoliths against the setting sun. The power failures now reached hundreds of miles inland, defying all logical explanations. In Europe, the situation was equally dire. The blackout had engulfed most of Western Europe, reaching as far as Berlin. The United Kingdom was almost entirely without conventional power, save for isolated pockets in the Scottish Highlands, where steam-powered generators maintained minimal functionality. Prime Minister Tennant had relocated his government to Edinburgh. The ancient castle transformed into a command center, lit by gas lamps and mechanical generators. Reports from across the British Isles painted a grim picture. Food shortages, medical crises, and increasing civil unrest.
The Chinese assistance teams have expanded their presence.
Reported the Home Secretary.
They've established what they're calling humanitarian zones in Liverpool, Bristol, and Southampton. In practice, these zones operate under their authority, not ours.
Do we have a choice?
Tenet asked wearily.
They have functional equipment, medical supplies.
At what cost, Prime Minister? They're mapping our infrastructure, positioning themselves for the recovery phase, assuming there is one.
In Moscow, President Kokolov faced a similar dilemma. The blackout had reached the city itself, rendering the Kremlin dependent on hastily installed steam generators. Russian military forces, initially deployed westward for humanitarian assistance, now served a more practical purpose, maintaining order in Russian cities plunged into darkness. China, meanwhile, had emerged as the unlikely beneficiary of the crisis. With its major population centers unaffected by the blackout, it positioned itself as the world's savior. Chinese ships delivered supplies to affected regions across Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Each delivery came with technical teams, security forces, and diplomatic staff, extending Beijing's influence under the guise of humanitarian aid.
The Americans are proposing a joint response,
reported Foreign Minister Liu to President Chen.
They're suggesting a coordination center in Iceland, powered by geothermal energy unaffected by the blackout.
Chen considered this.
Accept the invitation, but insist on equal leadership roles. Make it clear that any solution must include Chinese participation at every level.
In Washington, the steam-powered generators continued to churn out electricity, their black smoke creating an apocalyptic haze over the Capitol. The AERT had established a headquarters in the Pentagon, where walls were covered with maps tracking the blackout's spread.
It's advancing approximately 50 miles per day,
explained General Hayes, tracing a line across the map.
At this rate, it will reach the Mississippi River within 2 weeks.
What about Europe? Africa?
Asked the president.
Similar patterns. The blackout is spreading inland from all Atlantic coasts at roughly the same rate. Russia reports Moscow is now affected. Africa's western coast is completely dark from Morocco to South Africa.
And our allies?
The situation in Europe is deteriorating rapidly.
The Secretary of State replied.
The UK government has relocated to Edinburgh. NATO command structures are fragmenting without reliable communications. And frankly, sir, China is filling the vacuum. Their humanitarian assistance is effectively giving them control over key areas in Western Europe.
What about the Russians?
President Kokolov has gone dark, literally and figuratively. Our limited intelligence suggests he's preparing for a potential conflict. Russian forces are mobilizing under the pretense of emergency response.
Trumsky nodded grimly.
So while we're chasing ghosts, our adversaries are positioning themselves for the aftermath.
The Cyber Response Division had reached a dead end. The arrested hackers provided no useful intelligence, and the mysterious code continued to evolve beyond their understanding.
Sir,
Dr. Patel addressed the president.
I believe we need to consider alternative explanations. This doesn't fit the profile of a cyber attack or an EMP. The progressive nature of the blackout, the adaptive code, these suggest something fundamentally different.
Like what?
The president asked. Before Dr. Patel could answer, A Coast Guard officer entered the room and whispered something to General Hayes. The general's expression darkened.
Mr. President, we've just received a report from a marine biologist in Maine, a Dr. Sandra Reeves. She claims to have found, well, sir, it sounds fantastic, but she claims to have found evidence that marine organisms are undergoing rapid evolutionary changes. And she's identified microorganisms that may be responsible.
What does this have to do with our power grid?
The president asked impatiently.
She believes these microorganisms may be affecting electronic systems as well as biological ones. She's requesting immediate support to continue her research.
The president scoffed.
We're facing the greatest national security crisis in history, and you want me to divert resources to examine fish?
Sir,
Interjected Dr. Chen.
perhaps we should consider all possibilities. Our conventional explanations have led nowhere.
After heated debate, the president reluctantly authorized a small team to investigate Dr. Reeves's claims. The team included Dr. Marcus Thompson from Space Force, Dr. Gabriela Rodriguez from NOAA, and Commander James Wilson from the Coast Guard.
Keep this quiet.
Trumsky instructed them.
The last thing we need is for Moscow or Beijing to learn we're investigating sea creatures while they're positioning assets.
What if this is connected to their activities?
Asked the Secretary of State.
The Chinese have been investing heavily in deep-sea research in the Atlantic, and the Russians have underwater installations we know little about.
All the more reason for discretion.
The president replied.
If either of them are behind this somehow, I don't want to show our hand.
Unknown to the Americans, similar investigations were already underway elsewhere. In Britain, marine biologists at the University of Edinburgh had noted abnormal behavior in North Sea fish species. Using equipment powered by Scotland's remaining functional wind turbines, they documented physiological changes remarkably similar to what Sandy was discovering in Maine. Russian scientists at a military research facility near Murmansk had made even more significant progress. With access to deep-sea specimens collected by their still-functional submarine fleet, they had identified the microorganisms and recognized their technological characteristics.
They are like miniature machines,
reported Dr. Andrei Petrov to President Kokolov.
but they grow and divide like living cells. Nothing in our biological weapons program resembles these organisms.
Kokolov, ever suspicious, saw opportunity rather than mystery.
Can they be weaponized, controlled?
Unknown, Mr. President. We need more time, more specimens.
In China, President Chen received similar reports from scientific advisors. Chinese research vessels in the South Pacific had collected water samples containing identical microorganisms. Unlike their Russian counterparts, Chinese scientists focused on the electromagnetic properties of the organisms rather than their potential as weapons.
They generate fields that disrupt electronic systems,
explained Dr. Zhang, the lead researcher.
We believe they may be responsible for the blackouts affecting other nations.
And China remains unaffected because...
Chen prompted.
Geography, Madam President. Our major population centers face the Pacific, not the Atlantic, but our models suggest the organisms are spreading. It may be only a matter of time.
The American team arrived at Sandy's laboratory 2 days later, expecting to find an eccentric scientist with implausible theories. Instead, they found a methodical researcher with disturbing evidence. Secretly, The president stood in a back corner of the room just to listen.
These organisms
Sandy explained, displaying slides under her microscope.
appear to be technological in design, but biological in function. They're integrating with host tissues and rewriting DNA.
And you believe they're connected to the blackout?
Asked Dr. Thompson skeptically. Sandy nodded.
They emit an electromagnetic field unlike anything I've recorded before. It disrupts conventional electronics. And they're everywhere, in the water, in marine life, possibly in the air we breathe.
That's a significant leap, Doctor. Reeves?
Said Commander Wilson.
Then explain this.
Sandy replied, leading them to a large tank. Inside swam what appeared to be a deep-sea anglerfish, except it had no business surviving in the shallow tank. More disturbing still, its gills were shrunken, and primitive lung-like structures had developed along its sides.
It's breathing air.
Gasped Dr. Rodriguez.
That's impossible.
Not impossible,
Sandy corrected.
just unprecedented. And it gets worse.
She showed them her latest findings. The same microorganisms had been identified in samples from patients suffering from the mysterious respiratory illness spreading through coastal communities.
They're not sick in the conventional sense,
Sandy explained.
Their bodies are being transformed, just like these fish.
While briefing the AERT, Sandy found an audience ready to believe even the most fantastic explanations.
The microorganisms appear to be terraforming agents.
She explained to the stunned officials.
They're transforming marine life to survive on land and transforming humans to survive in water.
That's insane,
Whispered someone in the back of the room. It was the president.
Nevertheless, it's happening.
Sandy replied.
And based on tissue samples, I believe this process has been underway for decades, perhaps 50 years or more. It's only now reaching a tipping point.
Why?
Shouted the president, stepping out into the light.
What's the purpose?
I can't answer that without more data,
Sandy admitted.
but I believe the source is somewhere in the Atlantic. The epicenter of the transformations corresponds with the initial blackout zone.
After heated debate, the president authorized an expedition to the mid-Atlantic. A team of scientists, including Sandy, would travel on a retrofitted naval vessel, powered by steam engines, to investigate the source of the microorganisms. As the team prepared for departure, reports came in of the first violence. In coastal cities, transformed humans attacked those still unaffected. Meanwhile, strange creatures emerged from the ocean. Fish with limb-like appendages, crustaceans the size of dogs walking on adaptable claws, cephalopods using their tentacles to drag themselves across beaches. The world was changing, and humanity was unprepared for what was coming. Chapter 4. Into the Abyss. The USS Reliant, a destroyer hastily retrofitted with steam engines, departed from Naval Station Norfolk 10 days after the Atlantic event. Its conventional weapon systems remained inoperable, but the steam-powered engines pushed the vessel steadily through the choppy waters of the Atlantic. Sandy joined the expedition alongside a team of scientists, military personnel, and specialists from various agencies. Their destination? A point approximately 500 miles east of Bermuda, where satellite data from before the blackout had indicated unusual deep-sea activity. As they ventured farther from the coast, the transformation of the ocean became increasingly apparent. Schools of deep-sea fish swam near the surface, their bodies already showing signs of adaptation. Some had developed primitive limb-like structures. Others showed respiratory systems in transition.
They're preparing to leave the water,
Sandy noted, documenting the changes with a hand-cranked camera.
The question is, why now? What triggered this acceleration?
Below decks, the scientific team had established a makeshift laboratory powered by the ship's steam engines. Here, they examined water samples collected at various depths, each teeming with the mysterious microorganisms.
The concentration increases the deeper we go,
Reported Dr. Rodriguez.
and they're becoming more complex in structure.
4 days into the journey, they reached their destination. The ocean here appeared unusually calm, almost still, despite the surrounding turbulent waters. Depth soundings revealed an anomaly, a massive underwater structure nearly 2 miles below the surface.
It's not on any of our charts,
Commander Wilson stated, examining the primitive sonar readings.
and it's enormous.
The expedition deployed a submersible vehicle, specially designed to function without electronics. Instead, it operated on mechanical systems and was tethered to the ship by a physical cable. Sandy volunteered to join the descent team, along with Dr. Thompson and 2 naval officers experienced in deep-sea operations. As the submersible descended into the depths, the water darkened to an impenetrable black. The team used mechanical spotlights, their beams cutting through the darkness to reveal a transformed underwater landscape. What should have been barren abyssal plains now teemed with structures resembling coral reefs. Except these growths emitted a faint bioluminescent glow. Fish and other marine creatures moved among these structures, many displaying advanced stages of the transformation Sandy had documented.
It's like they're building something.
Sandy whispered, peering through the viewport.
An infrastructure for a new ecosystem?
At 10,000 feet, the submersible's spotlights illuminated the edge of an enormous underwater cavern. The entrance yawned before them, large enough to swallow a skyscraper.
My God,
breathed Dr. Thompson.
It's not natural.
The team guided the submersible into the cavern, following a path that sloped deeper into the Earth's crust. The walls pulsed with bioluminescence, casting an eerie blue-green light that made mechanical illumination almost unnecessary. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, the cavern opened into a vast chamber. What they saw defied comprehension. At the chamber's center lay a colossal organism, if such a term could even apply. Its body stretched beyond the range of their lights, its surface undulating with slow, deliberate movements. From vents along its massive form, clouds of microorganisms poured forth in endless streams, billowing outward into the surrounding water.
It's twice the size of the Empire State Building,
Dr. Thompson estimated, his voice barely audible.
Maybe larger.
Sandy stared at the entity, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what she was seeing. It wasn't a fish or a mammal or any recognizable form of marine life. Its structure suggested something both organic and engineered, as if grown rather than evolved naturally.
It's a terraform engine,
she finally said.
a biological machine designed to transform an entire planet's ecosystem.
Designed by whom?
Asked one of the naval officers. Sandy had no answer. The entity before them defied terrestrial explanation. It seemed as alien to Earth as a spacecraft, yet it existed here, deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, possibly for centuries or millennia. As they observed, a disturbing pattern emerged. The microorganisms flowing from the entity formed distinct currents, like a three-dimensional conveyor system. Some moved upward toward the surface, while others flowed laterally, presumably toward the continents.
It's coordinated,
Sandy realized.
This isn't random evolution, it's directed terraforming.
The submersible's mechanical camera systems captured as much footage as possible, but the team knew they needed to return to the surface to report their findings. As they prepared to leave, Sandy noticed something alarming in the water analysis equipment.
The concentration of microorganisms has doubled since we arrived,
she reported.
The entity is increasing production.
We need to leave, now,
ordered Dr. Thompson. As they navigated back through the cavern, the submersible's mechanical systems began to strain. The pressure gauges fluctuated wildly, and the temperature inside the cabin rose uncomfortably.
Something's affecting our equipment,
reported one of the naval officers.
The microorganisms might be adapting to our mechanical systems.
They barely escaped the cavern before the submersible's primary oxygen system failed. The backup mechanical pumps engaged, providing enough air for the ascent. But it was clear that even non-electronic technologies were not immune to the transformative influence of the microorganisms. When they reached the surface, they found the USS Reliant in disarray. Several crew members had begun showing symptoms of transformation: breathing difficulties, physiological changes to their skin and respiratory systems.
It's happening faster than we anticipated,
Sandy told the ship's captain.
The concentration of microorganisms in the water is accelerating the transformations.
With the affected crew members quarantined in improvised water tanks, the Reliant began its journey back to the coast. Sandy and her team worked frantically to compile their findings, knowing that time was running short. 3 days into their return journey, they received a garbled radio transmission from the mainland, the first functional communication since the blackout. The message, broken and distorted, painted a grim picture. The transformations had accelerated dramatically. Coastal cities were being abandoned as more people succumbed to the changes. Those in advanced stages of transformation had taken to the water, while strange marine creatures continued to emerge onto land in increasing numbers. More disturbing still, conflicts had erupted between the transformed and the untransformed. Military forces, already hampered by non-functional equipment and dwindling numbers, struggled to maintain order. As the Reliant approached the Virginia coastline, they saw the extent of the chaos. Norfolk, once a bustling naval hub, now stood largely abandoned. Plumes of smoke rose from various points in the city, where conflicts or accidents had triggered fires. The beach was littered with bizarre sights: marine creatures crawling or walking on newly formed limbs, some still dragging themselves awkwardly, while others moved with increasing confidence on their evolutionary adaptations. And in the shallow waters near the shore, human forms swam with new efficiency, their bodies transformed to thrive in the ocean environment.
We're too late,
Sandy realized as she surveyed the landscape.
It's already happened.
Chapter 5. The Vanishing Humanity. The USS Reliant never docked at Norfolk. With most of its crew now showing signs of transformation, the ship anchored offshore, while Sandy and the few remaining unaffected team members took a small boat to land. What greeted them was apocalyptic. The naval station had become a battleground between military personnel, fighting to maintain control, and transformed marine creatures advancing from the ocean. Gunfire echoed across the water, punctuated by strange, inhuman cries.
We need to reach Washington,
Sandy insisted.
If there's any chance of stopping this, we need the resources of the government.
Their journey inland proved harrowing. The roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles and desperate civilians fleeing westward, away from the advancing transformation zone. Occasionally, they encountered transformed marine life. Crabs, the size of dogs scuttling across highways. Fish-like creatures using newly evolved limbs to pursue fleeing humans. When they finally reached Washington 3 days later, they found a city under siege. The White House and Pentagon remained protected by military cordons, but much of the city had fallen into chaos. The steam-powered electrical grid still functioned in government areas, maintaining a fragile bubble of human civilization. Sandy's team was escorted immediately to the AERT headquarters in the Pentagon basement. There, they found President Trumsky and his remaining advisors, a much smaller group than before, awaiting their report.
Tell me you found something we can fight,
the president asked, his face haggard from sleepless nights. Sandy presented their findings, including footage of the massive entity beneath the Atlantic.
It's not a weapon or an attack in the conventional sense,
she explained.
It's a terraforming operation on a planetary scale.
Terraforming for whom?
Asked General Hayes.
For them,
Sandy replied, displaying images of the transformed marine creatures.
The ocean covers over 70% of our planet, yet terrestrial species, particularly humans, have dominated Earth's ecosystem. What we're witnessing is a reversal of that dynamic.
You're suggesting it's natural?
The president asked incredulously.
No, sir. The entity we discovered appears engineered, possibly by an intelligence we can't comprehend. But its purpose seems clear: to transform Earth's ecosystem to favor marine life, adaptable to land, while converting terrestrial species to aquatic forms.
How do we stop it?
Responded the president. Sandy hesitated.
I don't believe we can, sir. The microorganisms have spread throughout the global water system. They're in the rain, in our drinking water, in the moisture in the air we breathe. They're in the soil, in minerals, in metals. Based on my calculations, they've been spreading slowly for decades, perhaps centuries, establishing a baseline presence before this recent acceleration.
There must be something.
Insisted Dr. Chen.
A counter-agent, a way to target the microorganisms.
We've tried,
Sandy replied.
They adapt faster than we can develop countermeasures. And they're not just in our environment. They're already inside most of us, gradually rewriting our DNA.
The silence that followed was profound. The AERT members exchanged grim looks as the implications sank in.
So, we're looking at the end of humanity,
the president finally said, his voice unnaturally calm.
Not the end,
Sandy corrected.
A transformation. Those who adapt will survive, just not as the terrestrial species we've been.
As if to punctuate her assessment, alarms began to sound throughout the Pentagon. Reports flooded in of massive marine creatures emerging from the Potomac River. Creatures never before seen, with bodies adapted for land movement. Simultaneously, the first major systems failure occurred in the Pentagon itself. The steam-powered generators sputtered and died, as microorganisms, having evolved to affect even mechanical systems, infiltrated the machinery.
They've breached the perimeter,
reported a military officer rushing into the room.
We need to evacuate immediately.
In the chaos that followed, Sandy became separated from the AERT members. She found herself in the Pentagon courtyard, witnessing the collapse of the final bastion of human resistance. Military personnel fired desperately at advancing creatures, some resembling giant crustaceans, others like fish evolved with powerful limbs. But for every creature that fell, dozens more emerged from the river. And many of the defenders themselves began collapsing, their transformations reaching critical stages that made breathing air impossible. Sandy fled the Pentagon, making her way through streets filled with scenes of surreal horror. Transformed marine creatures hunted humans who had not yet changed, while partially transformed humans struggled with their changing bodies, some desperately seeking water to relieve their failing terrestrial respiratory systems. At the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, Sandy witnessed a grotesque tableau. Dozens of partially transformed humans submerged in the shallow water, their bodies contorted as they adapted to their new aquatic nature. Among them were government officials she recognized, military leaders, ordinary citizens, all united in their involuntary metamorphosis. As night fell, Sandy found herself alone on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, watching as Washington, D.C., the heart of human governmental power, fell to creatures emerging from the depths. The White House burned in the distance, a final act of defiance before surrender. Sandy felt the familiar tightness in her chest that signaled her own transformation had begun. She had perhaps days before her lungs would fail, and she would be forced to seek the water. The knowledge she carried, the truth about the entity beneath the Atlantic, would soon be meaningless in a world no longer dominated by human concerns. As dawn broke over the transformed landscape, Sandy made her way to the Potomac River. The water called to her changing body, promising relief from the increasingly painful process of breathing air. Along the riverbank, she saw others like her, humans in various stages of transformation, their eyes reflecting a mixture of terror and strange acceptance. The surface of the river teemed with transformed humans, their bodies now more adapted to water than land. Some retained recognizable human features. Others had changed more dramatically, with gill-like structures and webbed appendages. On the shore behind her, strange new creatures continued to emerge from the water, the vanguard of a new terrestrial ecosystem dominated by species with marine origins. They moved with increasing confidence, claiming the land that humans were being forced to abandon. Sandy waded into the Potomac, feeling immediate relief as the water covered her transforming body. Her final human thought, before surrendering to the change that would carry her species into an uncertain aquatic future, was simple. Earth had hosted many dominant species throughout its long history. Perhaps humanity's reign had simply come to its natural conclusion. The great reversal had begun. The land would belong to the creatures of the sea, while humans would return to the ocean from which their distant evolutionary ancestors had once emerged. And beneath the Atlantic, the massive entity continued its work, transforming a planet according to a design beyond human comprehension. Epilogue. 3 months after the Atlantic event, the transformation was complete. The coastal regions of every continent had been abandoned by untransformed humans, who retreated to shrinking inland territories. The former centers of human civilization, New York, London, Rio de Janeiro, Lagos, had become habitats for the new terrestrial species evolved from marine origins. In the oceans, transformed humans established new communities, developing methods of communication and survival suited to their aquatic forms. Some retained enough of their human intelligence and memory to create a bridge between their former existence and their new reality. Deep beneath the Atlantic, the entity continued its silent work, maintaining the new balance it had engineered. Whether it was a visitor from beyond Earth or an ancient presence that had always existed in the planet's depths remained unknown. What was clear, however, was that the dominance of humans over Earth had ended. A new era had begun, one in which the creatures of the sea would write the next chapter of the planet's long story. And somewhere in the depths of the Potomac River, Sandy Reeves, no longer recognizably human, but still carrying the memories of her former self, observed the New World Order with the curiosity that had defined her human existence. In her transformed consciousness, one question remained. Had this been a hostile takeover of Earth, or simply the planet's method of restoring a balance long disturbed by human supremacy? The answer, like Sandy herself, drifted somewhere between the world humanity had built and the ocean to which they had returned. The end.